Right now, somewhere in New York City, about 8.5 million people are waking up expecting to find food, and they will. No committee approved the shipments. No agency calculated the calories. Nobody's in charge of feeding New York, and somehow it never starves. Think about what that actually means. Every morning, the right amount of bread shows up at the right bakeries. The right cuts of meat reach the right butchers. Produce from California, fish from the Gulf, rice from Arkansas. All of it arriving in roughly the right quantities, at roughly the right times, distributed across 5 boroughs and 1,000 neighborhoods, without a single master plan coordinating any of it. If you tried to design that system from scratch, you'd need to know what 8.5 million people want to eat today, how their tastes have shifted since last week, which suppliers had a good harvest and which had a bad one, which trucks broke down, which roads are flooded, which warehouses ran low. You'd need to know all of it simultaneously, updated in real time, and translated into 10,000 separate decisions happening across the entire supply chain. No agency has that information. No computer has that information. No expert, no matter how credentialed, has that information. And yet the food arrives. I'll show you exactly why, and I'll show you why understanding this one thing will permanently change the way you read every policy failure, every expert prediction that didn't pan out, every intervention that made things worse instead of better. I'll show you, specifically, why trying to fix a system the way you'd fix a machine usually breaks it in ways that can't be undone. But first, I need to show you the assumption almost everyone makes, because it's the assumption I made and you've probably made it too, and it's quietly behind almost every mistake that's been made in economic policy for the last 100 years. When something works, we assume someone made it work. It's a deeply natural instinct. You see a bridge and you think, engineer. You see a symphony and you think, composer. You see a city that feeds itself and you think, administrator. Order implies a mind behind it. Design implies a designer. This isn't stupidity. It's actually a very accurate observation about most of the things human beings make on purpose. Buildings have architects. Laws have legislators. Armies have generals. For almost everything we can point to and say someone made this, there was a someone, and there was a making. The problem is when we take that instinct accurate in a limited domain and apply it everywhere. When we look at something that clearly functions, clearly has structure, clearly produces reliable outcomes, and assume that somewhere behind it is a mind that designed the whole thing. Because some of the most important, most intricate, most reliable systems in the world were never designed at all. You speak a language. Think about what that means. English has rules, grammar, syntax, tense, agreement, that are so complex that linguists have spent careers trying to fully map them. Native speakers follow those rules accurately, fluently, constantly, including rules they could never explicitly state. Ask a 6-year-old why I went is right and I goed is wrong, and they can't tell you. But they know. Who designed English grammar? Who decided that the past tense of go would be went? Who specified the difference between which and that? Nobody. It evolved. Across centuries of usage, across millions of speakers making millions of small adjustments, the language found its shape. No authority decreed it. No committee approved it. It emerged. Your immune system does something similar. Right now, without any conscious decision on your part, specialized cells are patrolling your body, identifying threats, coordinating responses, deploying targeted defenses against invaders they've never encountered before. There is no central command. No headquarters decides which antibodies to produce. The system is distributed, adaptive, and almost unfathomably complex, and it works better than any designed alternative has ever come close to matching. The internet, the thing you're using right now, grew out of a small government research network into the most complex information system in human history, and it did so largely without a plan. Engineers made decisions, standards emerged, protocols were adopted because they worked and abandoned because they didn't. The system that resulted wasn't what anyone designed. It's what happened when millions of people building things connected to millions of other people building things. Language, the immune system, the internet, New York's food supply. None of them were built. All of them work. There is a pattern here, a mechanism. And in 1945, an Austrian economist named Friedrich Hayek gave it its clearest explanation, one so precise that it predicted, with remarkable accuracy, the outcomes of economic experiments that hadn't yet happened. Hayek was asking a question that sounds almost too simple. How does anyone know what anything is worth? Not philosophically. Practically. The price of a house in Tulsa. The wage for a welder in Pittsburgh. The rate on a savings account in Birmingham. These aren't numbers calculated at a desk in Washington. They're the compressed result of millions of separate pieces of information, local conditions, individual preferences, specific circumstances that no single mind could ever hold at once. A farmer in Kansas knows things about the cost of his inputs, the quality of his soil, the condition of his equipment, and the mood of his market that no government agency will ever know. A machinist in Detroit knows things about his skills, his alternative options, and his family's needs that no expert can calculate from the outside. Multiply that by 330 million people, each carrying their own irreducible package of local, practical, personal knowledge, and you begin to see the scale of the problem. Hayek called it the knowledge problem. And the insight at its core was this: the information that an economy needs to function doesn't exist in any single place. It exists only distributed across all the people making decisions simultaneously. The price system, when it's allowed to work, is the mechanism that gathers that distributed information, compresses it into signals, and transmits it across the entire network without anyone having to understand the whole. Hayek wrote this in 1945 in a paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society, and here's how he put it. The price system is a marvel, not because it was brilliantly designed, but precisely because it wasn't. It emerged, and it does something no design system has ever replicated. It coordinates the behavior of millions of people who know almost nothing about each other, using only the signal of price to transmit everything relevant about scarcity, demand, and value. When the price of steel rises, every manufacturer who uses steel adjusts their plans, without knowing why the price rose, without knowing what's happening in the steel market, without needing any central authority to inform them. The price carried the information. They responded to the signal. Order emerged from the coordination of people who never coordinated directly. This is what Hayek meant by spontaneous order. Not chaos, not randomness. Order, reliable, functional, adaptive order, that arises from the interaction of individual decisions rather than from a plan imposed from above. The rules are real. The structure is real. But nobody designed it. It grew. And here's the thing that took me years to fully absorb. This is not a conservative argument or a libertarian slogan. It's a description of how complex systems actually work. The immune system doesn't have politics. The English language doesn't have an ideology. They're just examples of the same underlying reality. When the number of variables is large enough, when the information is distributed enough, when the conditions change fast enough, no designed system can outperform an emergent one. Not because designed systems are run by bad people, because the task itself is impossible. Adam Ferguson said it in 1767. Hayek quotes him directly, in a line so precise it should have ended certain policy debates before they started. History is the result of human action, but not of human design. People make choices. Outcomes emerge. And the outcome is almost never what any individual planned. The name Hayek gave to this phenomenon across his major work was spontaneous order. He drew a distinction between two types of order, what he called cosmos, the kind that grows, emerges, evolves, and what he called taxis, the kind that's designed, planned, imposed. Most of what we value most is cosmos. Most of what gets planned is taxis. And here's where the mechanism stops being abstract and starts being something you can see in the historical record. In 1917, the Soviet Union set out to build the most rationally organized economy in human history. Every major resource would be allocated by experts who could study the whole system and make scientifically optimal decisions. No more waste, no more inefficiency, no more blind market forces. Central planners would see the whole picture and direct production accordingly. By the 1980s, their central planning agency, Gosplan, was attempting to set prices for more than 12 million distinct goods. 12 million? Manually. The information required to price them correctly. Information about local conditions, individual preferences, substitution effects, technological changes was dispersed across hundreds of millions of people and couldn't be aggregated into any central bureau, regardless of how many computers they used or how many experts they hired. The result wasn't inefficiency. It was something more systematic. The destruction of the information the economy needed to function. When prices are set centrally rather than emergent, they stop being signals. They become noise. And when the signals go dark, everyone navigates blind. Bread was sometimes plentiful and sometimes absent, not based on harvest conditions, but based on whether the planners had recently revised the quota. Factories produced goods nobody wanted because the plan called for them and didn't produce goods people needed because the plan didn't account for them. The system didn't just underperform. It systematically produced the wrong things in the wrong quantities in the wrong places because it had destroyed the mechanism that would have told it otherwise. Hayek predicted all of this in 1944, not as a guess, as a logical deduction from the knowledge problem. If you eliminate the price mechanism, you eliminate the only known device capable of aggregating and transmitting the distributed knowledge an economy requires. What remains isn't a planned economy. It's an economy flying blind. You don't have to go back to the Soviet Union to see this. In 2015, Venezuela instituted price controls on basic goods, setting the maximum price for food, medicine, and household necessities by government decree. The intent was compassionate. Make these things affordable. The result, which Hayek's mechanism predicts with precision, was shortages. When the price of a good is set below what it costs to produce and distribute, the incentive to produce it disappears. Suppliers stop supplying. Shelves empty. By 2019, the International Monetary Fund estimated inflation had reached 10 million%. People who had saved their whole lives found their savings functionally worthless. You want a more recent example? In March of 2020, when the pandemic hit, several states moved to prevent price gouging on personal protective equipment. The intent was preventing exploitation. The mechanism said, when the price of masks can't rise to reflect the sudden surge in demand, the signal that would ordinarily call new producers into the market doesn't fire. The mask shortage wasn't fixed by the price caps, it was extended by them. The National Bureau of Economic Research documented this in real time. And closer still, from 2020 to 2022, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates near zero while the money supply expanded dramatically. Prices rose. By June of 2022, inflation hit 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. The experts who called it transitory were using models that didn't account for what Hayek had spent his career explaining, that you cannot expand the money supply without destroying the information that prices are carrying. When you inflate the currency, you don't just raise prices. You erase the map. That's not a metaphor. That's what happened to your savings. At this point, you might be asking the question that's been sitting underneath all of this. If spontaneous order works so well, if the mechanism is so well documented, if the evidence of what happens when you override it is this consistent and this clear, why do we keep doing it? This is where Hayek's last major work enters the picture. He wrote The Fatal Conceit at 89 years old, and the argument he made is one of the most important he ever produced. The instinct to plan isn't stupidity. It isn't corruption, or not primarily. It's something deeper. It's the natural extension of a cognitive habit that served us extremely well for most of human history. When our ancestors faced a problem, they solved it by thinking it through, designing a solution, and implementing the plan. That works for problems whose variables are small enough to hold in a single mind. Build a shelter, hunt a specific animal, organize a small tribe. The fatal conceit is applying that same instinct to systems whose variables are orders of magnitude beyond what any mind can hold. The conceit isn't arrogance in the ordinary sense. It's the unexamined assumption that because we can understand parts of a complex system, we can therefore design the whole. That because we can identify a problem, we can implement a solution without cascading effects we didn't anticipate. That because we're smart, we can replace what evolution and emergence built over centuries with something better designed. Because we can see what they couldn't. We can't. Not because we're not trying hard enough. Because the task itself exceeds what any designed intervention can accomplish in a system this complex. The economists who called inflation transitory weren't stupid. They were applying a designed model to an emergent system and trusting the model over the signal. The planners who set price controls weren't cruel. They were assuming that their designed fix could override the emergent mechanism without destroying the mechanism in the process. It can't. It never has. And here's what Hayek understood that most of his critics never did. You don't have to be malicious to cause harm in a complex system. You just have to be confident that you understand more than you do. Here's the thing that changes everything. The argument you've been hearing your whole life, the one about free markets versus government planning, about left versus right, about trusting the private sector versus trusting the state, is a real argument. But it's not the deepest one. It's actually a symptom of a more fundamental question that almost nobody states plainly. The real question is this: do you believe that the information needed to run a complex system can be held in a single mind or a committee of minds? Or do you believe that it only exists distributed across everyone participating in the system? That's not a political question. It's a question about the nature of knowledge, about what any human mind, however expert, however well-intentioned, however well-equipped, can and cannot know. If the information is genuinely distributed, if it only exists in the aggregate of millions of simultaneous decisions, then any attempt to concentrate that decision-making destroys the information itself. Not because the planners are bad, because you cannot aggregate what can only exist dispersed. The map doesn't transfer. You can't copy it to a central location. When you try, you don't get a more accurate map. You get noise. Your intuition, the one that bristled at expert overconfidence, that doubted the planner's ability to see what you could see in your own life, that distrusted the model over the experience, wasn't ideology. It was epistemology. You were tracking something real. The distributed nature of knowledge isn't a conservative belief. It's an observation about how complex systems actually work, confirmed in every domain from immunology to linguistics to economic history. The Soviet Union didn't fail because it was evil. Venezuela didn't fail because the wrong people were in charge. They failed because the task was impossible, and it was impossible for the same reason that no agency could plan New York's food supply. Not because no agency is smart enough, because the information doesn't exist anywhere except in the distributed choices of the people living inside the system. You can't replace that information. You can only destroy it. If this framework helped you see something you've been sensing for years but couldn't quite name, I want you to know there are 11 more warnings in this same tradition. Each one is documented, each one is applicable to the world you're actually living in. I put them together in a guide called The Serfdom Decoder, 12 of Hayek's core warnings, each explained with a real-world example from 2020 to today, and one ready argument for the dinner table. Not a substitute for reading Hayek, but the distillation I wish I'd had before I spent years doing that reading. You'll find the link in the description. What you have now is something most people never get. A name for the mechanism behind failures that everyone experiences and almost nobody explains at the level of cause. The knowledge problem. Spontaneous order. The fatal conceit. 3 phrases that point at the same underlying reality, that the most important systems in the world aren't built, they grow. That the information those systems depend on can't be centralized without being destroyed. And that the recurring pattern of well-intentioned intervention producing the opposite of its intent isn't a coincidence or a conspiracy. It's a predictable outcome of applying designed thinking to emergent systems. You already knew some version of this. You felt it when the experts said inflation was transitory and your grocery bill disagreed. You felt it when the model said one thing and the reality in front of you said another. You felt it when someone with a credential explained why the plan would work, and your experience told you it wouldn't. You weren't wrong. You were reading the signal that the distributed system was sending, the one the models couldn't capture, because models are designed and the signal was emergent. Hayek spent his career giving that signal a name. What you do with the name is yours. The question I keep returning to, and I'll leave it with you without an answer, because I think it matters more as a question right now, is this. What does it mean for a society when it stops trusting the systems it didn't design and only trusts the ones it did? Tell me the one thing you saw coming that nobody around you believed at the time.